They thought this was victory, but it was the smile of a man bleeding internally. In 1803, Paris glittered like a city that believed in its own immortality. Chandeliers burned bright in imperial halls, wine flowed freely among generals and ministers, and at the center of it all sat Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who measured destiny in miles conquered and crowns shattered. France still felt rich, it still looked powerful, and that illusion was the most dangerous thing of all. Because empires do not collapse when they are poor. They collapse when they believe they are wealthy. Louisiana was supposed to be France's resurrection. A continent-sized artery stretching along the Mississippi River, pumping future riches into the imperial heart. On paper, it was magnificent. Fertile land, trade routes, control over North America's spine. To Napoleon's advisors, it looked like blood returning to a wounded body. But the body was already sick. France entered the 19th century financially wounded, even before Louisiana became a serious conversation. The French Revolution had executed a king, but it had also destroyed a tax system. Aristocracy had vanished, but so had predictable revenue. The new republic inherited empty coffers, unpaid soldiers, and a mountain of debt accumulated by fighting Britain across decades. Debt is never just numbers. Debt is a shackle polished at first, invisible in the dark, but heavy once you try to move. France had borrowed aggressively to fund the American Revolution, hoping Britain would bleed longer than France would. Britain staggered. France nearly collapsed. The loans that once felt like lifelines slowly mutated into a financial cancer, spreading through the state's bloodstream. Interest payments consumed revenue. Currency lost credibility. Confidence, the invisible engine of every economy, began to erode, yet outwardly, France still looked imperial. This is where illusion becomes lethal. Louisiana entered the story as a fantasy of renewal. Napoleon imagined a reborn French empire, stretching from Europe into the heart of the New World. He believed land itself could cure debt. That territory could compensate for empty vaults. That geography could replace liquidity, but land does not generate wealth by existing. It generates wealth only when you can defend it, govern it, and feed it. And France could barely feed itself. The contrast inside France was already brutal. In Paris, elites debated strategy over silk-covered tables. In the countryside, peasants scraped for bread. The price of grain rose faster than wages. Inflation gnawed at the poor, while the rich insulated themselves with assets and privilege. This wasn't just inequality, it was an economic fault line. Currency is the blood of a nation. And France's blood was thinning. Revolutionary paper money had destroyed trust. Gold and silver fled circulation. The state survived on borrowing and promises. Every new military campaign demanded more spending, more printing, more debt. Napoleon's victories hid the rot, but they did not cure it. Then came Haiti. Saint-Domingue was the crown jewel of the French colonial system, the richest colony on earth. Sugar, coffee, slaves. It was supposed to finance Louisiana. It was supposed to be the engine that justified holding North America. Instead, it became the grave. Slave revolts erupted into full-scale revolution. French soldiers died by the tens of thousands, not just from combat but from disease. Yellow fever tore through the army like fire through dry grass. The financial cost was catastrophic. The strategic cost was fatal. Without Haiti, Louisiana was exposed. Without revenue, Louisiana was a liability. France now faced a terrifying equation: hold an enormous territory with a weak navy, shrinking finances, and the looming threat of Britain, still the world's dominant sea power. Louisiana could not be defended. And undefended land is not wealth. It is bait. Across the Atlantic, the United States was watching. America was young, fragile, and ambitious. It did not yet dominate with armies, but it was learning to dominate with money. The dollar, still finding its place, was becoming something more than currency. It was becoming a weapon. American leaders understood something Napoleon could not afford to admit. France's empire was built on debt, not cash. On dreams, not reserves. On paper strength, not financial muscle. And when an empire runs on borrowed blood, anyone who controls liquidity controls its fate. Louisiana, once imagined as France's future fortune, was now a ticking financial bomb. Britain could seize it. Maintaining it drained resources. Losing it by force would be humiliating. Selling it unthinkable just years earlier suddenly looked rational. This is the moment illusion cracks. France still believed it was rich. Still spoke like a superpower, still planned like an empire. But behind closed doors, the ledger books told a different story. Revenues lagged, debts matured. Interest tightened its grip around the state's throat. Empires rarely announced their desperation. They negotiated quietly. And that quiet desperation is what America would exploit. Because when one nation's currency becomes weak blood, another nation's currency becomes a blade. Louisiana was no longer about expansion. It was about survival. And in the next phase, we will see how easy dreams borrowed money, and imperial arrogance hollowed France from the inside long before a single dollar changed hands. Empires don't collapse from enemy fire first. They collapse from comfort. From easy money that numbs the pain while the disease spreads. By the time Napoleon seriously considered selling Louisiana, France was no longer fighting just wars on land and sea. It was fighting a quieter, deadlier battle inside its own system. This was not a collapse you could hear. No cannons. No riots yet. Just numbers on paper slowly turning against their master. This is where the rot begins. Easy money always arrives dressed like salvation. For France, it came in the form of borrowed confidence, short-term loans, optimistic projections, and the belief that future victories would pay for today's excesses. Napoleon's administration ran the state like a general runs a battlefield. Take territory now. Worry about supply lines later. But economies are not conquered. They are maintained. Every new campaign required advances from bankers. Every soldier marching east or south carried not just a rifle, but an invisible price tag. Interest compounded silently. Debt doesn't scream, it whispers, and France kept listening to the wrong voices. Corruption crept in where urgency lived. Contracts were inflated. Supplies skimmed. Middlemen grew rich while the treasury grew thin. War economies always produce winners, but they are rarely the state. The system began rewarding loyalty over efficiency, connections over competence. This wasn't moral decay alone, it was economic inefficiency calcifying into policy, and laziness followed. When borrowing becomes easier than reform, reform dies. France postponed painful decisions. Tax restructuring, spending cuts, civilian investment. Why fix a bleeding wound when another loan could cover it today? Easy money numbed the state, like opium to an injured body. But opium does not heal. It delays collapse. The French currency suffered quietly. Confidence eroded as paper promises multiplied. Inflation didn't explode overnight, it seeped. Prices crept upward. Savings lost value, trust drained away drop by drop. Currency, the blood of the nation, was no longer circulating freely, it was clotting. Meanwhile, the elite remained insulated. In Paris, life went on. Dinners, music, honors. Generals were rewarded with land and titles. Ministers spoke of glory and destiny. The rich lived in a different economic climate protected by assets, access, and influence. The poor felt every tremor first. Bread prices, rent, scarcity. This contrast was not accidental. It was structural. The state was feeding the machine of empire while starving the body that sustained it. And Louisiana, far away and undeveloped, became part of the illusion that this sacrifice was worth it. That future wealth justified present suffering. But Louisiana was not producing cash. It was consuming attention. Maintaining the territory required ships, officials, defenses all paid in a currency already losing strength. Worse, it required peace. And peace was something Napoleon could not afford politically or strategically. Then came the tightening. Interest rates began to bite. Creditors demanded assurances. Europe's bankers were no longer hypnotized by victories alone. They wanted guarantees. They wanted repayment schedules. They wanted hard numbers, not dreams of Mississippi prosperity. This is where the dollar enters the story more clearly. While France struggled under compounding interest, the United States operated with a different philosophy. It borrowed cautiously, spent selectively, and prioritized trade over conquest. American leaders understood leverage. They knew that money, when used patiently, could achieve what armies could not. The dollar was still young, but it was disciplined. And discipline is power. France, by contrast, was addicted to momentum. Every year required expansion to justify the last. Every victory masked deeper dependence. The empire was running not toward growth, but away from reckoning. Louisiana symbolized that contradiction. Holding it required strength France no longer had. Losing it by force would expose weakness. Selling it would admit vulnerability. So the territory sat there like an organ the body could no longer supply, slowly dying while draining the rest. Britain watched closely. The British Navy dominated the seas. One war just won and Louisiana could be seized overnight. Napoleon knew this, and fear is expensive. Fear forces decisions under pressure. Fear shortens time horizons. That's when desperation starts to look like strategy. Behind closed doors, French officials began reframing the story. Louisiana was no longer the future of empire. It became non-essential, overextended, a distraction. These were not strategic revelations, they were financial confessions. The rot had reached the core. France's dependence on borrowed money had stripped it of flexibility. Sovereignty doesn't disappear all at once, it erodes. First in budgets, then in options, finally in choices. By now, the interest had metaphorically reached France's neck. Every delay increased the cost. Every month Louisiana remained French was another month of exposure. The ledger books were bleeding red ink, and no amount of military glory could change arithmetic. And arithmetic is merciless. America sensed the moment. When a powerful nation starts selling assets, it is no longer negotiating from strength, it is triaging. And buyers who understand this do not rush, they wait. They let the seller feel the pressure. They let the debt speak. The dollar, sharpened by patience, was about to strike. Because once the rot is visible, collapse is no longer a question of if, only how cleanly. The moment the trigger is pulled, history doesn't ask who was brave. It asks who was liquid. The collapse did not begin with an explosion. It began with a calculation. By 1802, Europe was balancing on a blade's edge. Britain and France were technically at peace, but everyone knew it was a pause, not an end. The kind of silence that comes before thunder. Napoleon understood one truth with terrifying clarity. The next war with Britain would be naval, and France would lose it. And when France lost control of the seas, Louisiana would be the first corpse to float. This was the trigger. Britain's navy was not just a military force, it was an economic guillotine. It could choke trade routes, strangle colonies, and starve empires without firing a single shot inland. If war resumed, Louisiana would be isolated overnight. No reinforcements. No supplies, no protection. An undefended asset becomes a liability the moment war begins. At the same time, France's finances crossed a point of no return. Interest payments surged, military spending spiked. Tax collection lagged. The state wasn't just borrowing to grow, it was borrowing to survive. This is the most dangerous phase of any economy, because survival borrowing has no ceiling. Once debt is used to plug holes instead of build capacity, it accelerates collapse. France was now paying yesterday's wars with tomorrow's promises. The cancer had metastasized. And then reality reached the streets. Grain shortages worsened. Prices rose faster than wages. Urban workers felt it first, then rural France followed. Bread riots simmered beneath the surface. Not full rebellion yet, but pressure. Always pressure. The poor were paying for imperial ambition with empty stomachs, while generals still toasted victories. This is what economic massacre looks like, not instant death, but slow suffocation. Currency weakened further, confidence slipped. Merchants demanded higher prices. Credit tightened. When trust evaporates, money stops moving. And when money stops moving, economies freeze. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America saw opportunity crystallize into certainty. The United States didn't want war. It wanted access. The Mississippi River was America's jugular, its trade lifeline. New Orleans mattered more than territory ever did. If Britain took Louisiana, America would be economically strangled. So America moved not with cannons, but with cash. Here is where the dollar truly becomes a weapon. American diplomats approached France quietly. No threats, no urgency. Just interest, calm interest, the most dangerous kind. They knew France was cornered. They knew time favored the buyer. And they knew that desperation always negotiates poorly. Napoleon hesitated, but not for long. He ran the numbers. Losing Louisiana to Britain meant gaining nothing. Holding it meant risking everything. Selling it unthinkable just years earlier suddenly looked like the least bad option. This is the massacre moment. Not because $15 million was small, but because it was cheap for what was surrendered. Over 800,000 square miles. Control of North America's heart. Strategic dominance gone. Not conquered, not defeated in battle. Sold, quietly, clinically, and the money? $15 million did not save France. That is the most brutal irony. The payment barely dented France's debt. It funded armies that would soon march into disastrous wars. It bought time but not solvency. The shackles remained. The cancer spread. For the average French citizen, nothing improved. Bread did not get cheaper. Taxes did not disappear. Inflation did not retreat. The empire had sold land, but the people still paid the price. This is what makes it an economic massacre. The elite converted territory into temporary liquidity. The masses absorbed the consequences. Wealth moved upward. Pain moved downward, and sovereignty slipped away in silence. America, on the other hand, had just executed the greatest financial ambush in history. Without firing a shot, it doubled its size, secured its future, eliminated European threats from its western flank. And it did so by exploiting debt, timing, and discipline. This is how empires change hands in the modern world. Not through conquest, but through balance sheets. France had believed land could compensate for debt. America understood the opposite. Liquidity creates land. The trigger had been pulled. The damage was irreversible. Napoleon would go on to fight and lose catastrophic wars. France would bleed men, money, and morale. The $15 million would vanish into the furnace of empire. And Louisiana, once France's imagined salvation, would become the foundation of American dominance. The massacre wasn't loud, but it was final. Because once a nation sells strategic territory to service debt, it has crossed an invisible line. A line where sovereignty is no longer absolute, only conditional. A nation does not lose its freedom the day foreign soldiers arrive. It loses it the day its ledger stops belonging to itself. When the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, France did not collapse overnight. That is not how debt traps work. They don't explode, they tighten. Slowly, relentlessly, like a noose pulled 1 inch at a time. Napoleon believed he had made a strategic sacrifice. In reality, he had just revealed how trapped France already was. Let's open the ledger. France sold Louisiana for $15 million, roughly $300 million in today's terms. It sounds substantial until you compare it to the scale of the problem. By the early 1800s, France's war expenditures alone were consuming multiples of that amount every single year. The sale did not eliminate debt. It didn't even meaningfully reduce it, it merely postponed the reckoning. This is the core illusion of debt-driven decisions. Selling assets creates the feeling of relief without the substance of recovery. Like pawning your house to pay a credit card bill, you survive the month, but lose the future. France's sovereignty was now conditional on credit. Every campaign Napoleon launched after 1803 depended on financing. Every soldier marching into Europe carried a cost France could no longer cover internally. Taxation was politically explosive. Printing money destroyed trust. So the state leaned harder on lenders, and lenders do not lend without leverage. Interest rates reflected risk, and France was becoming risky. Each new loan came with tighter terms, shorter timelines, higher expectations. This is where sovereignty begins to leak away, not through treaties, but through constraints. France could still declare war, but it could no longer choose peace freely. It could still command armies, but it could not pause spending without collapse. That is not independence. That is financial captivity. Meanwhile, the contrast inside France sharpened. The imperial elite still lived above the storm. Titles, estates, confiscated lands, wealth circulated at the top. But the average citizen paid in inflation, conscription, and scarcity. Young men were taken for wars that fed the debt machine. Families were left behind to survive rising prices and shrinking opportunity. Debt always socializes pain downward. And here's the most forensic detail. The Louisiana money never rebuilt France's economy. It didn't modernize infrastructure. It didn't stabilize currency. It didn't reform taxation. It was swallowed by war, immediately converted into smoke and blood. The asset was gone. The liability remained. This is the debt trap in its purest form. Once a nation starts selling strategic assets to service existing obligations, it enters a loop. Next time pressure rises, there are fewer assets left to sell. Fewer options. Less leverage. Eventually, the only thing left to sell is policy itself. France would experience this humiliation repeatedly in the decades to come through foreign pressure, forced indemnities, and financial subordination after military defeats. The pattern was set here. Compare this with America. The United States emerged from the deal with expanded sovereignty. It owned land outright. No foreign creditor controlled Louisiana. No interest payments drained future budgets. America had traded cash renewable, replaceable for territory permanent, and compounding in value. This is the asymmetry that defines economic power. France traded irreversible assets for temporary liquidity. America traded temporary liquidity for irreversible assets. One side reduced its future to survive the present. The other side sacrificed the present to own the future. That is why this was not a purchase. It was a transfer of sovereignty. France's decision was rational under pressure, but pressure itself was the evidence of captivity. A truly sovereign nation is never forced to sell its strategic core to meet short-term needs. By the time Napoleon fell, France's finances were exhausted. The wars ended not because strategy failed, but because money did. Armies can march on courage for a while. They cannot march without pay. And the lesson was written permanently into history's balance sheet. Debt doesn't just limit choices. It chooses for you. Empires fall in battle. Nations fall on spreadsheets. And spreadsheets never forgive. France did not repay its debts quickly. It did not recover cleanly. And it did not learn the lesson immediately. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, France was forced to pay massive war indemnities to the victorious powers. Foreign armies occupied French soil. Gold flowed out of the country, not in. It took decades, not years, for France to stabilize its finances. A generation paid for decisions made under pressure long before they were born. This is the real cost of debt, time stolen from the future. Louisiana was gone forever. No repayment could bring it back. No reform could reverse that transaction. What was sold under stress remained sold in peace. And while France rebuilt slowly, the United States accelerated. The land purchased for $15 million became farms, cities, railways, ports. It generated wealth not once but continuously. Each decade multiplied its value. Each generation inherited opportunity instead of obligation. This is the compounding effect of sovereignty. America didn't just buy land, it bought optionality. Freedom to expand, freedom to trade, freedom to grow without asking permission from creditors. That freedom would later translate into industrial dominance, military power, and financial hegemony. France, by contrast, spent the 19th century managing consequences, revolutions, restorations, financial restructuring, political instability, all connected by one invisible thread: economic fragility created by debt-driven choices. Now step back. This story is not about 1803. It is about every nation that believes debt is neutral. Debt feels harmless when money is cheap. When lenders are friendly, when growth is projected, but debt changes behavior. It rewards short-term thinking, it punishes patience. And eventually, it demands collateral. Sometimes that collateral is land. Sometimes it is policy. Sometimes it is dignity. Modern nations repeat this cycle under different names: aid, bailouts, stimulus, rescue packages. The language evolves, the mechanism does not. Easy money creates dependency. Dependency erodes sovereignty. And sovereignty, once diluted, is never fully restored. France was not weak when it sold Louisiana. It was over-leveraged. That distinction matters. Because many powerful nations today are not collapsing. They are negotiating, selling assets, trading autonomy for liquidity, convincing their populations that survival today justifies surrender tomorrow. History tells us how this ends. Not with invasion, not with flags falling, but with choices quietly disappearing. The Louisiana Purchase was not theft in the traditional sense. No guns were raised. No borders were crossed by force. It was far more sophisticated and far more devastating. It was a financial execution. America understood that money, when controlled, is more powerful than armies. France learned too late that land cannot save a nation drowning in debt. And that is the eternal lesson. Sovereignty is solvency. If you don't own your debt owns you. Because in the end, empires don't fall when they run out of land. They fall when they run out of control over their own future.